I'm Jenniffer Wardell. I'm a young adult fantasy author, though I also make some inroads into spy fiction. My most recent fantasy novel is Fighting Sleep. It's a humorous twist on Sleeping Beauty, and my most recent spy novel is Dirty Deeds Done for Reasonable Prices. They're both available as very cheap ebooks. Come see me.
I am Kathryn Purdie. I'm the author of the Burning Glass trilogy with HarperCollins. It's young adult fantasy, and then my new duology coming out with them in about a year. The first book is called Bone Grace.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to just kind of pick on one of you, and if you look at me super panicked, I will move to someone else. So my first question is it important that the audience actually like your villain? We're going to go with Jenniffer to start on that one.
Okay, I think like is the wrong term because some of the best villains just suck. But I feel they have to be interesting. They have to be sometimes terrifying. So they have to be very fully realized, but the point, if a villain is too likable, then they're not really the villain so much, they're Loki.
Loki.
I have no problem with Loki.
I know.
Yes, but he's not really a villain.
Loki over Thor all day, sorry.
Not sorry, that's just the truth.
Kathryn, do you want to take a shot at that?
I would say that we need to understand why they do what they do. We need to understand their motivation. We don't necessarily have to like them. I think we have to understand where they're coming from. And so I do think we need to slightly empathize with them just because we understand why they turned out the way they are. Like Voldemort in Harry Potter, he's like one of the purest evil villains there is, but we, throughout the series, we learn his childhood, and he was even like a very dark child and stuff, but we see, like, really Harry could have turned out the same way almost, and because Harry and Voldemort have so many similarities, just because there's like they're a foil of each other, we also, it makes us understand why he ticks, and so we are invested. And that does make them interesting. We have to know, they can't just be like evil for the sake of evil. Like Voldemort has an agenda, and we're very clear on what that is. And we know why he does what he does.
So I think that's the redeemable part then coming in, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask, I was going to call you Mike, and then I was
okay.
like, that's
I'll
not
be
right,
Mike.
that's not right.
I'll be Mike.
Can I slide in a brief contradiction really quick?
Yes.
Oh, here
Okay.
it begins.
No, I was going to say, that's for the redeemable villains, yes.
I'm gonna
But the thing
He's
is,
not redeemable.
well, no, okay. The relatable villains was very important, but the thing is, like, the most common, I think probably the most common villain in the world today is a rich, spoiled white guy. And,
That would be me. I got money, I'm spoiled.
and the thing is, you can understand those kind of villains, and frankly, I find those villains more terrifying than some of the other ones, but I can't relate to them, but that doesn't make them less of a villain. So I think part of it is what you're going for in the character.
So Brian, can you grab the is it important to be likable question, as well as do you feel, like Kathryn had mentioned, that having empathy toward that villain is important?
Yes. So my favorite villain was always Darth Vader. I'm old enough to have been a little kid and saw Star Wars originally when it came into the theater. As just a really small boy, and I remember, I'm just to set this up. I'm adopted. I'm an orphan. I have no idea who my original biological parents were, and so when Kenobi is explaining to Luke that Darth Vader hunted down and killed your father, I was like, just the way my orphan brain worked, I was like, no. I bet Darth Vader is his father. I thought that immediately. That's just the way. That's just. I don't know if there's any other adopted people in here, but we actually think we're kind of special. We do think we're the farm boy with a destiny, really. And so.
That's awesome.
And so I was like, telling all the kids in school after. Darth Vader is really Luke's, and they're like, no, you're crazy. Because they thought I was crazy because I'd also been telling them that Stevie Nicks was my real mother. And so, like, she gave me up for adoption, to go be a rock star and everything. And they're like, you've already tried to fool us with the Stevie Nicks thing. We're not buying Darth Vader as Luke's father. But I always kind of thought of Darth Vader as kind of my own surrogate father. So I was very empathetic to him at all. And so was that what you were asking me to talk about?
That's not why I'm laughing. It's just that your daddy issues are Darth Vader. It's hysterical.
If you want to know what a joining of Stevie Nicks and Darth Vader looks like, it's right there.
That was awesome. Thank you. Okay.
Landslide has taken on a whole
I know. They're never going to ask me to moderate again. Okay. So when you're dealing with villains, I think that there is a level of importance to making sure that they are not too unlikable. There are lines, I feel, and I'm going to ask the panelists what their opinions are on this. And I just forgot the name I'm looking for. Harry Potter, that female professor that came in. Yeah, yep. I literally almost couldn't watch the scenes. It, for me, crossed that line where I don't even care because I kind of just want to, stab her. It's just awful. And so the panel is the redeemable, the likable. How do we do that? So my question for you guys is, oh no, I lost my question. How do you keep your villains likable while still maintaining their goals and intentions in that book? So,
we'd just like to qualify the actual name of the panel is sympathetic but not redeemed. Are we talking redeemable villains or not redeemable villains?
We just talk complex villains.
Yeah.
We're going to go with complex villains. I think that's appropriate.
Because I both are great, but I just want to know what direction.
Well, I think, so redeemable, I think you can look at it either way. So if you're looking at sympathetic but not redeemable, that doesn't mean that, the Voldemorts of this world are somehow redeemed in the end and all is well, but you still have this sympathetic, you have this empathy for them, and you can see why, you can understand. So how do you maintain that balance? How do you write your villains and make it so people don't want to throw the book across the room, but still keep them a villain and keep their intentions for their bad guy business intact? Does that help? Does that work?
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Kathryn, will you start on that?
I think you can give them just enough of likable characters for a protagonist to get you there. Like, a villain can be absolutely awful, but then have a soft spot for his niece and be the hero to her. And everywhere else, he's a horrible person. Or he can have a great sense of humor, but be absolutely awful. So just something like that gives him enough charm or enough of something for us to grab onto that we just don't want to Dolores Umbridge him. I liked Dolores. I mean, I love to hate her, so I'm fine with that. I mean, just the kitties and the pink outfits and everything. But there's a line for everyone, right? It must have struck a nerve or something from your childhood.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I think you do just give them at least one of those things that you would try to give a likable protagonist, and then everywhere else they can be nasty.
First, I'd like to apologize for my earlier contradiction. It's too early in the morning.
We're good.
I completely
Panelists,
forgot that the word sympathetic was in the panel.
We're good.
Okay. Also, I think it helps to give them a reason that's at least somewhat understandable. Because, mass murder, we're all killing everyone who did you wrong. We're okay. We all have a hit list.
I get it.
Admit it. But whatever your villain's reason is, and like I said, genocide, not really a sympathetic reason, try to find some element to it, bring it down to a point that someone reading could go, I get that. And it's probably a bigger, more dramatic version of whatever very dark human, whatever very human impulse we've all had. But we all have those moments that we don't want to talk about in like public. That is, sympathetic villains are really great because they get to take those dark feelings and then dramatically run down the street with them and let us picture all of those things we fantasize about doing in our heads, but never would because we would get arrested.
So just...
Sorry, I did turn it off because they were...
So just as an aside, I'm a sergeant in the Utah State Prison. That's what I do for my day job, besides write books in the evenings and on weekends. So Monday through Thursday, I'm pretty much surrounded by what you might consider villains. What I do is I've worked in the mental health unit, I've worked in the gang unit, I've helped run the library system there, and I've taught creative writing classes, and when you are around people that have all committed felonies, you do get to know them as people, and they are redeemable. We're called correctional officers for a reason, people have committed crimes, and we try to help them become better, because they're all coming back into society, right? Except for maybe a handful at the Utah State Prison. Every one of those guys is coming, and girls that have committed crimes, is coming back into society. So we believe that they are redeemable. One of the things, when they've committed every kind of crime imaginable, and but they're going to live among us. One of the things is I write books, and I was going to keep it on the down low in the prison that I was an author, but they found out. And they can order my book, and every felon and gang member in the state of Utah knows that I'm a writer now, which is alarming in and of itself.
You can't use their stories anymore.
Oh, there's been times where they will once in a while say something really profound to me, and I'll be like, wait, stop. I'll start writing it down, and they'll, you're not, oh, Sergeant Durfee, you ain't gonna use me in a book. And I'm like, yes, I am. But I wanted to make the point that in the beginning of my series, there's a character who is an assassin, and she tortures some people in a dungeon. And later on, she has to come to grips with the fact that she's kind of a bad person. And because she's killed a lot of people in her job as an assassin, and someone calls her a murderer, and she's like, well, I'm not a murderer, it's just my job. And I'm not a bad person, I'm just doing my job. And the guy's like, no, you're a murderer. And there's a quote towards the end of this book I'll read you where he talks about the people that she killed while they were in the dungeon. And he says, does being in prison make one man worse than another? Does the prisoner not have hope or dreams or the potential to change? Or are those in prison not but forgotten souls, condemned to be used in some cruel torture? So he's kind of calling her out on her evilness, and she's sort of starting to find out that she is kind of been a bad person her whole life. So, she tortured prisoners, she's an assassin, and she's coming to grips with maybe those prisoners weren't as bad of people as that deserve to die, and maybe she's kind of the bad person, and maybe she needs to change. So yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say earlier, like, the villain always believes he or she is right. There's maybe less than 1% of villains in stories or in real life that actually believe they're evil and doing something evil. It's really important that they believe and justify that what they're doing is right. To them, they're the hero.
I think this next question is going to tie into both that and what Brian just said. I really love your point of view and the experience that you've been able to have in seeing these prisoners long term. So I'm actually married to a police officer who, he doesn't like me to announce that, but we're doing that anyway. And because he's not here, he only sees them on their worst days. And so he actually really struggles to see that redeemable quality sometimes, because he's the one getting, yelled at on first meeting. And whereas you are actually spending time long term getting to know their personalities, not just on their bad days. We've all had those days where we act like a lunatic and we are super embarrassed because we just had a rough day. So my question is, how do you ensure that your villains are three-dimensional? And I think that's also going to tie back into what Kathryn was pointing out. So I'm going to start with Brian, and then I'm going to move down the line, if that's good.
Well, how do you make sure?
Oh, sorry, that was total accident.
How do you make sure they're three-dimensional? I really don't know. You just take a wild stab at it and hope you hit the mark, I guess.
Good luck,
You look at
from all angles.
Yeah. Like in my previous example, I was hoping that I was making my assassin three-dimensional by making her kind of question her whole life's choice, all of her life's choices in the end, you know? Let me think of some.
If you need time to think, you can, let them
I'll let
take it.
these guys do it.
Okay.
That is not, okay. Even if the story is not from their perspective, you have to be able, like, most of us are also nerds and we will like argue motivation about characters and things for like hours. You have to be able to do that to your villain. Like, even if the story's not from their perspective, you have to be able to get up in court or a thing and be able to explain why that person is absolutely right. You can know they're not right. You don't have to have the story say they're right, but the thing is that the person, like she said, they know they're right. What argument would they make in court to defend themselves? Because they all have one. And if you have, when writing characters, no matter good, villain, whatever, one of the most important things to know is why they do what they do. Because we all have reasons for what we do. Sometimes they're really stupid reasons, but we always have reasons. And you need to know the reasons why your villain is doing what they're doing and be able to argue them successfully. And if you keep that in mind, the character will naturally be, like, that's a good starting place to make a more well-rounded character because you understand them on a really fundamental level.
Yeah, for me, I find like I do a lot of pre-writing before I actually write my book. So when I'm outlining and brainstorming, I spend a lot of time developing my main character and their backstory and their internal and external objectives, and I plot the whole book out. And of course, there's a villain, and I do this almost every book. One day I'll learn. I know that what the villain wants. I know what their end goal is. I know like the external things really well as I'm plotting, and I almost always forget to dig deeper with my villain initially in the pre-writing. It all comes together in the end with plenty of revision. But usually I get about a third of the way into the book, sometimes half, and then I start to feel like really stuck. And it's almost always because I don't know my villain's backstory. And so what I'll do is I'll just like, I'll spend a day, I'll just stop writing, and I'll spend a day like writing my villain's backstory. Like, and that's kind of explains more internally, and it seems like so obvious, but we do spend so much time thinking about our protagonists that sometimes we just think more about like the villain as this external force against them. But we need to understand just, how they came to be the way they are. Not just because I internally knew what made her tick as far as like why she wanted what she wanted, but knowing the backstory almost always solves that problem. So like I said, it all comes together in the end, and I have to do plenty of revision and then go back. And it's not that you have to like throw in a big, huge flashback chapter or chunk of backstory. All that stuff can be woven in, but just even knowing it changes how you write their dialogue, changes every interaction. And then the other thing I wanted to say is yesterday on a panel, the keynote, I'm forgetting her name right now, the lady that wrote The Girl Who Drank the Moon, Kelly, she talked about how, it was a romance panel, but she talked about how a person, getting to really know a person, there are some, you don't really know a person unless you know their family, their job, like, not that you have to like meet these people, but like you really have to understand all facets of their life, because we are like a sum of all of our parts. That's what shapes us, and it's the same thing for our villains. In order to really truly understand them and identify with them, even if we don't agree with them, we have to be able to identify. and relate on some level, then we have to know them, and that means we have to know all about them. It might not all have to be on the page, but we have to know as writers for them to come across authentically.
That is, it's so, like, you were reading, yeah, mind reading down there. So where my brain was going was just to offer to you guys a way to kind of help you do what these amazing panelists are talking about. To get that depth and to understand your villain, try to understand your own villains. So we all have people that we just don't get along with, and they hit us the wrong way, and they repeatedly do things that you don't understand, and it's really hard to step back and try to understand where they're coming from. But once you do, it releases a lot of that pressure, and it will help you so much with writing villains. So I have a person in my life who says horrible things to me underneath the banner of, you know, religious goodness, and it's really hard and it's very painful, but I eventually had to step back, and what I came to the conclusion of was, in her heart, she really believes that she's doing what's right. She's not doing it out of maliciousness. Does that change what she's doing? No, it's super hurtful. But she's not doing it to be mean. She's doing it because, like they've talked about, she thinks she's right, 100%. And she's doing it in her mind with the best of intentions. So if you can step back from your own personal villains, I think you can learn a lot on how to write them, how to make them three-dimensional, how to make them whole. Jenniffer, I'm assuming you have something.
The Slytherin cheater style hack you can do to that is if conceptualizing your own villains is too hard for you, because I'm a very simple-minded person, give the villain one of your own failings. Because we're going to write our own failings really sympathetically. But let's be honest, like a couple bad days in a row and we could all become supervillains. So if you have a tendency towards selfishness, make your character really selfish. If you really get obsessed with like status and what other people think of you, inflate that and give it to your villain.
Awesome. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to really quick. We actually got a Twitter question from, I think that's Katie, right? I was going to say Caddy, but that did not sound right. So she'd like to know, do the panelists ever construct stories planning to redeem their villain? And if so, how do they do it? If not, how does that make a better story? Do you need that repeated? Or are we good?
I can answer it, but you had your hand out like you wanted to go.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll go after you.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I'll repeat it. Do the panelists ever construct stories planning to redeem their villain? If so, how? If not, how does that make the story better?
So in my books, they're all big, huge Game of Thrones size epic fantasy. So I've got a half a dozen protagonists, a half a dozen villains, and I treat each one differently. You know, like we were talking about, does every villain need to have a backstory? Well, there's one villain in my story that I purposely keep her the backstory a mystery to the reader to the very end. The others I give stuff to, but to be honest, she's in the reviews that I've read on Goodreads and Amazon, she's like the character that everybody really likes. Nobody knows why she's bad. In fact, in book 2, towards the end, I have one of the other characters kind of say, hey, why are you such a bastard all the time, you know? And she's like, oh, you really want to know? Well, let me tell you. When I was a kid, I had a birthday party and nobody showed up to it. And it really hurt my feelings. And he's like, really, that's why? And she's like, no, that's garbage, I just made that up.
I was like, please.
I
know. No one listened to him.
But it's kind of a humorous moment. He's like, well, if you're not even going to take the conversation seriously, why are we having it? And she's like, you really want to know? And he's like, yeah, I really want to know. He's like, well, when I was a kid, my brother killed my little kitten. And he's like, are you still? And he's like, yeah, that's all nonsense. But that's all the information she's ever going to give anybody. She's just been in war for 10 years and she's just a bad person, you know? What was the question? Because I don't think
So you did need it repeated.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you plan, when you construct your stories, do you do so planning to redeem the villain at the end? And if If so, how? If not, why, basically?
Yeah. So like I said, some of the villains I do plan on redeeming in the end. Some are going to be evil to the very end. And if you've got a multi-level, if you've got a books as big as mine and you can have numerous villains, you can get away with that. If you've got more of a smaller story, you probably need to focus. You know, if you've just got the one villain, you probably need to narrow it down exactly what you're going to do. And I don't know exactly how to do all this. As writers, I think we just give it our best effort, and at least that's what I do, and hope that the readers enjoy it.
So I think that I teach a writing class about crucibles, and I think that this can apply really well to this. I have written stories where the villain gets redeemed and the villain doesn't get redeemed at the end, and I do know my ending before I begin because I'm a major plotter. But I think it's important, if it's the true villain of your story, that that villain needs to stay the villain until the climax. They can't be redeemed until that point, or else the conflict and the tension is going to break. And that's where the idea of the crucible comes in. So a crucible is a container that holds things together until they melt together in white hot heat. Like, that's chemistry. Like, you put two different metals in there. But in writing, you put more than one character in some kind of container, and that pressurizes them. And that container can be a physical thing, like the arena in the Hunger Games, or the container can be something emotional or mental, like a job. You're just doing it because it's your job, and you can't just like quit your job so easily, right? Like, you've got a sense of duty that compels you to stay in that job and do what you're doing. Or you're in a family. You can't just be like, I quit my family one day. It's not so simple. Or a marriage, or you love someone. Maybe you love someone that's a horrible person, but that doesn't mean you just can snap your fingers and stop loving them so easily. So there's things like that that hold things together. And the story ends when the crucible breaks. And so they have to leave that. Like, if you're actually going to leave your family, that entails like getting disowned, changing your name. Like, it's really difficult. Or you finally decide that the person the abuser you're in love with isn't worth it, and you break apart from that. But if that's the true villain of your story, like I said, that container, you can't escape the arena of the Hunger Games or whatever, like, till the very end of the story, because that's your tension. So if they're going to be redeemed, it has to come at the end, I think, when the crucible breaks, or they learn how to solve their problems within the crucible. I hope that makes sense. I have a whole hour-long class about it, but that's my very nutshell version. So
Yeah, she had to condense really quick. She did really good. How many of you guys are familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender? Yes, you all have such good taste.
now they're awake.
Okay. So there are pretty much 3 possible arcs you can do through villains. 1, total villain throughout. There you don't have to worry about redeemed. 2, the sort of sympathetic moment at the end, which is really where and if this is your main villain, this is probably the most redeemed you want to make them, because like she said, you still need a villain. That's really more of what I think of as like the Darth Vader moment, that he was pretty bad throughout, but like at the end he had, like a moment where he had to look at his life. But if you want to truly sit down and redeem your villain, go full Zuko.
Yeah.
You have Zuko, my favorite. You have to have something else to serve as a villain or a dangerous situation. Like, the reason why the writers could spend so much loving time redeeming Zuko, and honestly, I think he's probably my favorite redeemed villain in anything ever. But they could do that because Ozai was still there wanting to break everything. So if you're really going to redeem your villain, you have to either have like a big villain. In my book, Fighting Sleep, it's not a villain, but there's still a really terrifying situation that everybody has to stop, which sort of serves as the not human villain, and that I can keep the tension going until the end. But if you are going to really sit down and redeem your villain, 1, give them the arc and the time in the story needed, because one of the big differences between Zuko and, say, Kylo Ren is Zuko, the authors really sat down and showed this is where they came from, this is why he's like he is, these are the experiences that he had to go through to become better. And Kylo's like, oh, this thing happened, it was really bad, but he's okay, really. The difference between that that
But he's
is,
so hot.
yes, but he's done other roles where he doesn't murder people. But so, all three of those arcs are completely valid, but you need to know what one you're going to do going in so that you can plot your story accordingly.
Thank you. That was great. Katie, hopefully that answered your question. I am still watching Twitter, so again, if you guys have burning questions, shoot them up. I've got my phone up. In the meantime, how do you guys avoid villain cliches? And we all know that there are a lot. You know, you've got the like, that comes into the Disney films, and it's just very, very cliche. How do you work within those cliches without kind of overusing them, and it's become this very painful trope to watch your villain be just a little overly evil? Does anyone want to take that start? Kathryn?
I think you beware the evil villain monologue at the end where they're so good. I mean, sometimes you can get away with them a little bit, but you want your protagonist to figure out these things. You don't want it to be like just a blindsided what? I mean, it's cool to have like the twist, but at least leading up to that moment, the protagonist should have started to see a lot of things coming together and had a very strong hint, or at least pieced part of the villain's story together. Because you don't want this big scene where the protagonist is just watching in shock and mostly silent while the villain says, and here's why I did everything, and this is how I did it. So you got to be careful of those. That's one thing.
If you insist, if you need to write a villain monologue, write it, but just don't put it in the story. Write it for your own amusement. I'm going back to something I said earlier, but knowing the real reason why they're doing it. Because even like in Fighting Sleep, I basically had to write the Wicked Queen character, who did this really awful thing to her actual niece. And so like on the surface, that's just like the worst cackling thing ever. But like she said, I went into her childhood and I saw where she was coming from, and it was an awful thing, but I understood why she did it. And the thing about cliches and why they're so cliches is cliches don't have nuance by their very nature, because it's something that needs to be repeatable again and again and again. But the thing is, humans are not repeatable. So if you make the cliched character human with very recognizable motivations, then by that very nature you will escape the cliche, because it becomes a real person.
Have your villains be smart. You know, in every James Bond movie I've ever watched, the villain will capture James Bond at some point and just dangle him over a tank of sharks and go, ah, ha, ha, I'm gonna kill you, and then walk out the door. And then he walks out the door, you know? And then
he always has a secret thing from, Q.
Yeah.
They gotta like check his pockets.
Yeah, and so James, the villain just vanishes out the door, and ha ha ha, I've killed James Bond, and the rope slowly lowers James Bond into the tank of sharks, or whatever it is. It's something different every time. But that's a cliche, like, a movie cliche is the villain just never just walks up and kills the guy. And I tried to avoid that in my books by, if my villains ever meet my protagonists, it never goes that, my protagonists they're in a lot of trouble. Let's just say that. They don't get a chance to escape, you know what I mean? And if they do, it's a real battle kind of a thing.
Yeah. Going along with that, you want to have a villain that's worthy of your hero. Like, we spend so much time making our hero super awesome and super tough and whatever. But if your villain isn't smart enough or savvy enough or witty enough or whatever enough, then it's just, there's not much tension on the page, because you're just like, my hero's got this. You want it to be like, oh my gosh, how is my hero going to defeat this person,
Yeah, it needs to look like there's no way that they can win, until the end, because that is what adds the tension. And I'm going to add to this particular question really quick, and then Jenniffer, I'm going to let you take that. I see with a lot of newer writers or people who are starting to deal with villains really for the first time, the tendency to turn them into psychopaths at random points. There are not a lot of actual psychopaths in the world. They're there, but there's not a lot of them. So if you're going to make your character a full psychopath, you need to understand what that means, and it needs to be consistent throughout your story. What becomes a problem is when you have someone who has redeemable villain qualities, or is a normal-ish bad guy, and all of a sudden they're doing stuff like, well, I'm randomly going to gut this cat in front of you and cut its I mean, it's like that's a psychopathic quality, and if you didn't establish that in your character, you can't add stuff like that in just to make the reader horrified. So it's really important to really choose where their lines are, I think, and make sure that you don't cross those. Jenniffer, did you?
Oh, sorry, just one more thing you can do for your villains. Give them access to all of your trope knowledge. Because villains are persecuted in fiction because, they never get told the whole, don't leave the superhero, don't leave James Bond hanging from a thing and then leave. Let them, even if your book is in such a way that you can't play with the tropes, though if you're doing humor, having them play with the tropes is very entertaining. Let them, because often when you're watching a movie and you're watching, it's don't these guys never watch this kind of movie. Let your villains have seen all the movies. Don't have them make the easy mistakes, and then that automatically becomes, and it's more challenging for the author, but in a fun way that you need to be doing.
So I'm going to make this point, and I'd love to hear your guys' feedback on this. The way that I always describe, I think what you're trying to say is when I can see the author's hand in the work. Yeah. When there is, you're moving towards an event and all of a sudden it's just so convenient that, the villain just walks out, leaving James Bond. And it feels like the author didn't quite know what to do, and they're like, okay, James Bond has to get free, so we're just gonna have him leave the room. That works. Instead of actually taking that time to make the harder choice, maybe putting all the pieces together a little tighter to make sure you can come up with a solution that the reader buys, isn't annoyed by. What do you guys think about that, and how do you do that? Does it someone? I don't feel bad throwing this one on someone. Who wants to take it?
I don't know. There's a whole chapter in one of my favorite writing books about this. The book is Stein on writing, I think. Sol Stein is a master editor, and he has a book about writing. But anyway, he calls it beware of things being contrived. Mm-hmm. So it's another way of saying just what you're saying. And honestly, sometimes we get so close to our work we don't have eyes for it ourselves, and that's I think where you just need to have an editor or a beta reader to be I didn't believe this part. Really, why not? Because we didn't see. For us, it was believable, and then they can. To me, I mean, in general, we have tricks to avoid author filter words and things like that to avoid the author hand. But at the end of the day, I think you need second eyes to really get down to the nitty gritty on our little moment. I mean, that's for me anyway. Yeah. So.
I'm also a professional film critic and just pretty much established as a super movie nerd among all my friends. And so when they'll watch something, they'll ask me, okay, why did this character do this thing, or why did this happen? That made no sense. And my answer is 90% of the time, narrative convenience. Yeah. Because the author of the thing needed to have something happen, and so they just made this implausible thing. So, like I said, a second reader is very important, but if you don't really have one, during the editing process, honestly, during the writing process, you are too close to it. You're gonna miss these things. But during the editing process, after you've stepped back and you're trying to look at the story as impartially as possible, if it's the kind of thing that would annoy you if you saw it in a movie, you gotta fix it. My editor / beta reader, there's 3 or 4 times where she's pointed to things in my story and go, this doesn't really, really? And because I am inherently very lazy, I will argue. I have these long arguments about why this makes total sense, why it's implausible. Inevitably, a week later, I go back and I change the whole thing because she was right. You have to, like, in the first draft, maybe you can do that, but in the edits, it's a lot easier to rely on narrative convenience, but for the sake of your hero and the sake of your villain and the sake of your story, you can't do it.
Go ahead.
This is unrelated to anything we're talking about. Actually, it's related to one of you guys said something about have your villains know the tropes of the movies. And if for some reason that made me think about back when I was traveling in Europe, and I found out that when I was at Dachau prison camp visiting, Adolf Hitler was like the ultimate real life villain, right? And he was a huge movie fan. And there was some actors that were in the war, like Jimmy Stewart, and who's the guy that was in Gone with the Wind? What was that guy?
Clark Gable.
They were both soldiers in the World War II. I mean, they quit their acting jobs to enlist and go fight in World War II. And Adolf Hitler said, anybody captures these guys will get, a lot of stuff, I mean, Adolf Hitler took his movie fandom and turned it into this twist, like everything he did. Turned it into this twisted, like, capture the movie star for me, these people that I've been watching. And I remember on the opposite spectrum of that, I was in Amsterdam in the Anne Frank house, and she was also a movie fan. And if you've ever been, I don't know if any of you have been to the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, but her bedroom is still the way it was left, with all the pictures of the movie stars that she loved. That she'd pulled out of the magazines and taped to her wall. And I sat in that room with a lot of tourists around me, and I was crying like a baby. Because I was just like, and I could see the look in the tour, who's the fat American blubbering like a baby? And I mean, who's that guy? But it just struck me the polar opposite way that good versus evil sort of with the film industry. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah.
The commonalities between the
Yeah.
two
So
sides.
I was thinking more about the contrived thing and the believability thing. For me, it tends to crop up because I'm a big plotter, right? But I also veer like a third from my outlines. I plot forever and ever and ever, but then I follow my characters at the end of the day. And I make the right choice by following them. But often what I do is I realize my character wouldn't do this. And I write what they would do. But often that's the thing that my editor flags, not because it was the wrong thing, we keep that thing, but it's because it wasn't set up, because I had just thought of it in the moment. So that was the right path, but usually things are contrived when they're not set up well. And so that's kind of a warning sign. Whenever you do that, you're following your character, that you did the right thing, but then realize, what did I miss in leading up to this?
That's fantastic. Seriously, the setup is everything. It's really important that you grab that. And Jenniffer, I'm really sorry. I have one quick question. It is for you, actually, and then I'm going to open it up to time. Guys, I'm sorry. I thought we got to. Anyway.
If there is a question, you can.
Yeah, you guys can come up. Thank you so much. I really apologize. I thought we had a couple more minutes. Thank you so much.